Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to this special edition of Newsmakers, the best of living here. I'm Fred Martino. Today we take a closer look at some of the historic places to explore in southern New Mexico. Many visitors to our state may not know about these places, including a former military base, Fort Selden, the Fountain Theater in Mesilla, a pottery factory in La Luz, and a church that continues to write its rich history.
Fort Selden was established as a historic site in 1972. And so for many years it's been operated by the New Mexico Historic Sites. But we're very excited right now because we've got a lot of great future plans for Fort Selden. And we're working on those right now. We're doing some preservation work on the ruins. We're also developing some new tours, some school outreach programs, and doing some new research on the fort. And we want to share that with our visitors.
Fort Selden was established in 1865. The reason for it to be here was to protect settlers in the Mesilla Valley and travelers on what had been the Camino Real. You were responsible for 16,000 square miles, though, which made them fairly inefficient. The fort was decommissioned in 1891. Through its tenure, the various companies that moved through this post, there were an awful lot of them. 4 of those companies were black troopers, or what we now refer to as Buffalo Soldiers. When the fort was established in 1865, a company, the 125th, were the first federal soldiers here, and they were a Buffalo Soldier unit. You also had 2 other infantry units, the 24th, you had the 38th, and you also had the 9th Cavalry.
So once the fort was established here to protect travelers and settlers on the Camino Real, it was an important part of the development of the entire valley.
In helping the community, the hospital that was part of the post here had a post surgeon. They were usually better trained than a lot of the local doctors. It was probably the best hospital anywhere around here, so if your family could get you here, the doctor would take care of you. So it was a very nice provision for the entire valley. So it was a boon, like any other military post today, to the local economy.
Living on a frontier fort was a real challenge for women. And the officers were the ones whose wives came to the fort. And so we have a lot of accounts, historical accounts of these women and what they wrote about living at a fort. And it was quite a challenge and quite a different type of environment for them and for their children. I think just the idea of not being in a community where you have all of the things you would expect, your women's groups and your people to help you with different chores. I think all of those things just became a big challenge here for those women. And also I think just really being so isolated from other people and from larger communities was a real challenge.
The soldiers had done such a good job by 1878, the military found no reason to keep the fort occupied, so all the soldiers moved out. But once they had left, they started having problems with the Apaches, so the post was re-garrisoned in 1881. The post commander that re-garrisoned the fort at that time was Arthur MacArthur, a young Douglas MacArthur's father. He arrived with his wife Pinky and their other son Arthur. In Douglas's memoirs, he stated that at Fort Selden as a young lad that he learned to ride a horse and fire a gun before he could read or write.
In the museum we have a visitor center, and it has a really interesting exhibit that has a lot of photographs from the frontier forts. They're not all of Fort Selden, but they give you a real picture of what life was like living on the fort. And so we've got a very nice visitor center. Of course, we have restrooms. We are open 9 to 5, Wednesday through Sunday, and there are rangers here that can help visitors to answer their questions and to give special tours for people who ask us to take them through the fort. And so there's a lot of opportunities here to really learn about the history of the fort, but also I think to just really experience what it's like to be in an authentic historic site.
The United States has a rich history of movie making, and in the early days, of course before television and even before radio, going to the movies was the only way that people could experience the outside world. So it was a very rich tradition and a very important part of daily life in the community. People had an opportunity to see what was going on in the rest of the world. Then it made things much more accessible to people. It's believed that the site itself was where Confederate and Union Army barracks were contained in the Civil War area. The oldest part of the building dates back to the late 1800s, and that's the front wall. But the theater itself was built in 1905. The history of the Fountain Theater actually starts with Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain, who moved here in the late 1800s and was a very prominent citizen in Mesilla, was an attorney, and he was involved in a lot of very controversial issues at the time. He had a lot of political enemies, and he was passing over the Organ Mountains, and he disappeared. They never found him or his son, Henry, who was traveling with him, and it's believed that he was murdered by some of his political enemies. His son, Albert Fountain Jr., built the theater in 1905 as a venue for the Fountain family to perform. So in the early days of the theater, it was a vaudeville theater, music variety show. The Fountain family was a family of performers, and so the theater was actually built with them in mind. It was in 1912 that Albert Fountain started showing silent films in the Fountain Theater. And the subtitles were in English, but because the audience was Spanish speaking, he had to translate the English subtitles into Spanish. And he would actually inject little jokes or personal asides into the narrative to entertain the audiences. In 1914, Albert Fountain Jr., son of the original owner, began the murals. And through the teens and 20s, he worked on the murals until they were completed. But over the years, they have been touched up and refurbished due to damage and plaster falling, that sort of thing. Albert Fountain III started showing talkies. That began in around 1929, and until the early 1950s, that was what the theater showed. And then there was a period of time when the building was not used except for storage. It reopened again in the early 1960s with another descendant of Albert Fountain, who then presented more contemporary films to the community. It was in the early 60s also that the Las Cruces Community Theater started working here. The owner of the theater at the time, Arthur Fountain, leased it to the Las Cruces Community Theater, making the theater accessible to NMSU theater department as well as using it as a venue for films. So that was quite an opportunity for people in the community and for people at NMSU because it provided a venue for experience outside the university setting where the public could come and see their performances.
We loved it here, and it was old, and it was historic, and it was important to have these murals on the side, the stage here. But the most important thing about this place was how at that particular time and energy, the people that connected to it were extremely gifted in the arts. And we didn't do fluff. This was where Mark Menoff got his opportunity to do a lot of his original plays, and he directed, and we were boundless. We had energy galore, and we were fearless is what we were. This was one of my favorite, the effect of gamma rays in the Men Marigolds. I was 25 when I did this play, but I was playing a 14-year-old. I remember when I was rehearsing, my hand was shaking, but of course opening night is you walk on stage and it's magic.
As far as the theater goes, this year and probably next year, some additional changes will be made, including new theater seats and new cafe seating in the back part of the theater. I think for many years to come, the Fountain Theater will be standing and will continue to thrive in the community as a venue for the arts, which is a fantastic opportunity for people in the community and visitors who come from outlying areas.
It was founded by a Rhode Island gentleman named Roland Hazard III, who was traveling out to Santa Barbara and had car trouble in La Luz and had to wait for parts and fell in love with the region, which doesn't surprise me. And he discovered the clay here was comparable to the best terracotta clays in Italy. In 1920, they consolidated their 5 chemical companies into one and renamed it Allied Chemical and Dye, which of course later became Honeywell. So that kind of gives people a sense of how prominent the Hazards were. They're one of the founding Rhode Island families. As best I can tell, this is the last surviving industrial downdraft ceramic kiln left in the United States. This is it. And a downdraft kiln is a very specific type of kiln where the heat is drawn down from the top of the kiln through the floor and then under and out. That evens out the heat, keeps the bottom of the kiln as warm as the top would get. This would be fired at about 2,000 degrees for close to a week. Of course, everything vented up this big stack. It's about a 12 by 12 space inside that can be completely filled with ceramics. And as you will be able to see, about 4,000 of the roof tiles from the last firing of the kiln are still in there. They produced a huge number of pots. There were some 100 identifiable shapes or models of pots, simple plates and cups through ceramic bells and everything else you can imagine. and of course the roof tiles. They were the principal roofing for St. Joseph's Apache Mission in Mescalero. Several of the buildings on main campus, Milton Hall and Kent Hall, have La Luz tile roofs. La Luz Pottery was marketed through a main office in 52nd Street and Park Avenue in New York, marketed to some 44 states and 4 foreign countries. There's a lot of La Luz pottery all over the country. They would stamp them with their official logo, the back-to-back capital L with a candle flame, and that was a registered trademark. The quality and the color of the clay, this very distinctive red terracotta clay, is pretty unique. And I think the reason the pottery didn't survive was largely that there were other commercial tile producing businesses in New Mexico that produced mission tiles mechanically. The noteworthy aspect of La Luz tiles was that they were handmade. Downtown Alamogordo, and they have some displays there about the pottery also.
So this was kind of a unique thing that this Roland Hazard had a dream about and started up. It's an interesting thing because New Mexico is known for its Native American pottery, but American art pottery in this state is not that common. In fact, I don't know of another American art pottery factory at all. I think it's a very interesting factor that we have this.
Roland was a very heavy-duty alcoholic, was one of the principal inspirations for Bill Wilson, who went on to found Alcoholics Anonymous. Members of AA know who Roland H. is, but he never really escaped that scourge of alcoholism. I'm well aware of quite a bit of this because Roland also happens to be my third cousin. We've renovated the interior, removing the residential additions to leave 2 large open rooms, that one of which we hope we'll be able to put into use as a small pottery studio, and hopefully we'll be able to recruit local potters to do demonstrations, particularly for the school kids. And we're going to be able to preserve the 230 acres of the natural environment surrounding it too. Visiting La Luz Pottery is pretty easy. Typically, throughout most of the year, I do a guided tour on Saturdays every other weekend. And to add your name to an upcoming tour is to call the Tularosa Basin Historical Museum.
The history of the church goes back to being built in approximately 1860. Went through a flood and a period of rebuilding during the first few decades. But generally it was a church until it was deconsecrated. The population seemed to move to Hatch, and so the diocese built a new church in Hatch. And this, like I said, this church was deconsecrated and has not had a mass since 1964. And it has been in private ownership since that time. Our understanding is that through the years, major things have been done. Replastering the walls, they were originally raw adobe. The part of the church behind you there was open ceiling, and so that ceiling was put in the 1890s, we believe, something like that. A piece of the church fell down over here, the archway, during a dynamiting for some water and sewer. by the village. And so we think that was in the 70s or 80s or so, and so that was restored. It is primarily the same original structure. We understand that there are 2 priests that are buried underneath the altar. We find that, of course, very interesting. Outside in the courtyard, we also have a little gypsy boy who is buried here. Either he died from disease or he was shot and killed, and the family asked that he be buried here, and so he was buried here. So we know of at least those 3 individuals that are on the property. My sister and I found out about this church on the internet. We had a friend who actually found the property and emailed me and said, check this out. The property was so unique. That is why my sister and I decided to get it. How often do you have a chance in life to buy a church? So I did. I was down here within the week and purchased it shortly thereafter. What we have done as far as restoration since my sister and I have owned it have been primarily repair on a structure that's old, the plaster cracks. So we have done a lot of replastering. And then with replastering comes painting. So we have spent a lot of time doing those kinds of repair works. We have, for instance, 2 irrigation systems on the property, and those have needed a lot of repair. But what we hope to do is we are keeping it as a church formation like you see it now, and we're hoping to use it for events. If people would like to get married here, if they would like to have quinceañeras here, or any kind of celebrations, family reunions, retreats. We welcome all those kinds of activities. We also have sleeping arrangements that can go along with those events. We would hold the events either in here. We also have a very large inner courtyard. We also have a rectory, the original rectory of the priest, and so that provides also space for meeting space as well as accommodations for sleeping. Since the whole church property is a city block, we have lots of room for possibly like tenting, and we have the village of Hatch is looking towards having a beer and wine festival in October. And so we would have those kinds of vendors set up outside in the exterior of the property, outside of the church. People can contact us either by stopping by or calling us. My phone number is 720-272-4026. My sister's phone number, her name is Alice Marley, and her phone number is 712-420-5719. And then also we have a Facebook page, and that's at St. Francis de Sales, Hatch, New Mexico, and that's NM. Those are the primary ways to contact us. We have visitors, and quite frequently. Whenever the gates are open, we're home and we welcome anyone to come and see the church. And what we've noticed is that people who were baptized here or married here, or they were maybe the altar boys here, they are in awe of this church. They rever it. They find it a very holy place still, even though it's not officially, a church. The emotions that people have seeing their church it is really heartwarming to see. The best part of this church and property would be the historical significance. Through the years, all of the celebrations that have occurred here, all the memories that have been formed here. So it's quite a very special place.
Thanks for joining us for the best of living here. This program is only possible because of our producers, Joe Widmer, Ralph Escandone, and Christian Valle. Subscribe to KRWG News on YouTube so you never miss a segment. And if you have an idea for the team, send us an email. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu.